So from GLP-1 to now oral counterpart, which is DPP4 inhibitor, popularly called gliptins. So what I'm going to do is to look for the cardiovascular outcome data, and we'll try to dissect out which DPP4 inhibitor after these CVOT outcome trial. Ladies and gentlemen, you know that we don't have any CVOT outcome trial now left with DPP4 inhibitor, except that Carolina full result will be presented in forthcoming ADA in United States. But then the Carolina is an active control trial. We are already done with all placebo-controlled trial of DPP4 inhibitor. This is my agenda. I am going to talk and critically analyze CVOT outcome trial, and followed by I will try to understand what could be the clinical take-homes for clinician. So if you look the entire portfolio of DPP4 inhibitor, as we talked, we have 4 dedicated CV outcome trial started with sebertimi in 2015, simultaneously presented and published. Same day examine was presented at ADA in 2015 with allogliptin. So this 2 trial was presented in 2015, soon followed 1 year down by TECOS trial with sitagliptin. Very recently we had Carmelina, this is linagliptin placebo controlled trial. And there is another 5th trial, as we talked about, currently done, which is called Carolina, but this time linagliptin was compared to sulfonylurea glimepiride. We know the top line results of Carolina. I am not going to talk Carolina because we don't have details. I know many pharmaceutical company has pushed their gun out and tried to say that we are done with Carolina, but please remember that it's good to know that glimepiride was at par as far as the cardiovascular safety is concerned with linagliptin, but that was the composite of 3-point MES only. We have only that much data into public circulation that it achieved the non-inferiority on composite of 3-point MES. We don't know even the individual component of 3-point MES. Please remember, in IMPAREG outcome trial, there was significant reduction in the 3-point MES, but when we dissect out individual 3-point MES, there was a signals of increase in stroke, although that wasn't statistically significant. Similarly, we need also to see all those individual endpoint of 3-point composite in Carolina trial. Furthermore, we don't have any data on heart failure hospitalization and many other secondary endpoint, including unstable angina requiring hospitalization for Carolina. So this is not a time where we should fire our cylinders by trying to suggest that sulfonylurea is as good as linagliptin through Carolina. Wait, have a patience for further 2 months. So I will skip my discussions for Carolina and will talk about only placebo-controlled trial, which is 4 trials of sebertimi, examine, TECOS, and Carmelina. The other DPP4 inhibitor which is available in our clinical use is vildagliptin. As you all know, vildagliptin is not undergoing any cardiovascular dedicated outcome trial, but they have undergone an investigator-initiated heart failure trial called VIVID and was found to be neutral. Similarly, there are small-scale trials. These are observational study which is currently undergoing with gemagliptin called Optimus, and another study called Top Level with tenaligliptin, but they are by any sense not at par with a dedicated CV outcome trial which has been done with Sexa, Allo, Sita, and linagliptin. With this background knowledge, I will focus my discussion on 4 dedicated CV outcome trial. And here it is, as you know, that out of this 4 CV outcome trial, sebertimi, examine, and Carmelina, they looked for 3-point MES as their primary composite. Initially, Carmelina had a 4-point MES projection to start with, but later on, Carmelina changed their game plan and deducted 1 point from 4 point, and they finally looked for 3-point MES. The TECOS was one trial in entire CB outcome basket along with Elixa, which looked for a 4-point MES, and the 4th point being hospitalization due to unstable angina. The classical 3-point composite of all these CB outcome trial, as you all are aware, were cardiovascular death, non-fatal MI, and non-fatal stroke. The Carmelina was different from other previous 3 CB outcome trial in the sense that they had one pre-specified renal composite as a secondary endpoint, which was a composite of 3 renal components, which was time to first occurrence of end-stage kidney disease, renal death, and sustained decrease of more than 40% in eGFR from baseline. So this was 3 composite as a secondary endpoint in the Carmelina trial, which other previous 3 CB studies didn't look for. Although they looked it as a post hoc analysis, but that wasn't a pre-specified secondary endpoint as Carmelina did. And Carmelina being the 4th outcome trial, they tried to be little different from the previous 3 CB outcome trial. So what happened in this 4th trial will be the next slide to look for. And here is the data of this 4 CB outcome trial. As you all are aware, that out of this 4 CB outcome trial, the TECOS had the largest number of patient population. It was the longest CB outcome trial among the CB outcome trials with 4 DPP4 inhibitor, and 100% of patients in TECOS trial had an established cardiovascular disease. That was exactly the case with Examine in alogliptin. So if you really want to see the sickest cardiovascular patient in 4 CB outcome trial, perhaps Examine had everyone with established myocardial infarction in past 3 months. Whereas in TECOS, this was a mixture of, the MI with other cardiovascular disease that includes a stroke and peripheral vascular disease. The Carmelina was different, as I said, that they have more kidney patients, more patients with established chronic kidney disease. And here is the result in terms of their primary outcome. All were neutral on the composite of either 3-point miss or 4-point miss as in TECOS. As you can see, their HR is dot on 1, suggesting of cardiovascular neutrality. When you look into the secondary endpoint, as in Carmelina, as I said, it was a pre-specified renal composite endpoint. There wasn't any benefit in the composite of renal outcome, and there wasn't any harm either on these renal composite. So the earlier belief that linagliptin has a potential to protect kidney wasn't seen in a pre-specified manner when Carmelina really looked it for as a secondary endpoint. Nevertheless, it was neutral, there was no harm, thereby meaning that you can use all these 4 DPP4 inhibitor in a patients with established cardiovascular disease, considering that they are cardiovascular neutral drug. The only issue which has happened that this statement may not be correct, because as you know that the one signals which came out statistically significant was heart failure hospitalization. In the Sabertimi trial, there was 27% increase in heart failure with sexagliptin. And that is the reason why FDA initially put a level both on sexagliptin and alogliptin that this should be avoided in a patients who had established cardiovascular disease and established kidney disease because there was a signals of heart failure in these subset of patients with sexagliptin, of course, surely. And there was a trend as well in the alogliptin in Examine. That wasn't the case with sitagliptin. It was absolutely neutral on heart failure, and same was the Carmelina. I will go into little detail later on. There was some trend of increase in non-fatal MI in the Carmelina, but it wasn't statistically significant. Why this point is important in the context of Carmelina, that if you see the phase 2b/3 data of linagliptin, there was some suggestion of increase in arrhythmia with linagliptin. There were some pulled data which suggested that there is a potential of having a increased cardiovascular events in the linagliptin arm compared to the placebo. That's there even in the US FDA dossier. And this signal was somewhere also seen in the Carmelina, but the good point was that it didn't came statistically significant. So that was one difference in Carmelina compared to the previous 3 CB outcome trial. Well then, so people now tends to, because Carmelina came damn neutral and like the TECOS trial, so, that is what the incisive comparison I would like to do. And if you see this Carmelina and TECOS trial, in terms of number, as we talked, number of patients, TECOS was much larger than Carmelina. It was much longer than Carmelina. Carmelina was 2.2 year. TECOS was 3-year trial. So if you see the number of events per patient per year, at any point of time, TECOS has larger number of events than Carmelina. As we talked, the TECOS trial had 100% patients with established cardiovascular disease, as opposed to only 57% in the Carmelina trial. The difference being that in Carmelina, 80% of the patients had EGFR less than 60, defined as kidney disease, whereas in TECOS, only 20% of the patient had established kidney disease with EGFR less than 60. So if you combine both the population of patients, means patients with established cardiovascular disease and established kidney disease, somewhere data is still suggesting that TECOS had more sicker patient, given that the TECOS was having a large number of patients and roughly double number of patients with established cardiovascular disease compared to Carmelina. So if you really a science believer and try to understand that which trial had more sicker patient, it's very difficult to actually answer, because 80% of patients in Carmelina had kidney disease, while 100% of patients in TECOS had established cardiovascular disease. It's up to you to understand which patients are more sicker, a patients with a MI or a patients with kidney disease. To me, perhaps both trials look similar as far as the sicker number of patients is concerned. Now, if you see the heart failure at the baseline, even the TECOS had much more number of patients with established heart failure compared to Carmelina. I will go into detail in next slides on heart failure. But one important point, from the Indian perspective, that there was no patient from India which was recruited in Carmelina, whereas there were more than 1,000 patients from India, which was the part of TECOS trial. So if you try to see in the Indian context, perhaps TECOS stands out because there was no patients from India in Carmelina. Now, if you see the heart failure patients recruited in these trials, so you see in EXAMINE there was 28% patients with baseline heart failure. In Sabartimi it was 13%. In TECOS it is 18%, whereas in Carmelina it was 27%. So on paper it seems that Carmelina had highest number of patients with established heart failure, but please remember that Carmelina is half of the number compared to the TECOS trial. So in terms of sheer number of patients with established heart failure, the TECOS stands out with the highest number of patients with established heart failure. Now, even if you go further down and try to classify what type of heart failure patients were recruited in these CB outcome trial, if you see the patients with class 3 and 4 NYHA heart failure, again you would like to understand that highest number is there in the TECOS trial. These data are not yet out for Carmelina, and we are keenly looking at how many patients with NIOHA class 3 and 4 were recruited in Carmelina trial. Nevertheless, if you see the Carmelina trial and heart failure outcome, it came absolutely neutral, very much like to the TECOS trial, and the initial apprehension which the sexagliptin and allogliptin put into because of increase in heart failure signals with sexa and trend as well in allo, that was completely not the case in Carmelina as well. So even if you try to stratify as per the different baseline criteria, there was no signal whatsoever, irrespective of the EGFR of the patient. And this is very important to understand, that because Carmelina had 80% patients with CKD, these are the patients to look for the heart failure data. And in Carmelina, even patients with EGFR less than 30 didn't show any signals of heart failure hospitalization. This perhaps speaks volume that the initial impression which we had with sexa and allo, that a DPP4 inhibitor may have the potential of increase in heart failure, doesn't seem to be the case after the TECOS trial, and now confirmed through the Carmelina with linagliptin. Well then, So this is one important slide I would like to show because I have seen some of presenter would like to misuse this data. If you see the Carmelina heart failure outcome data, and if you see this supplementary table, which is published in Lancet, now you would be surprised to see that in some of the subgroups in Carmelina, there was a suggestion that there could be an improvement in heart failure, especially if you see the patients in the Asian cohort. It seems that there was suggestion of improvisation in the heart failure, with even the p-value of interaction looking to be statistically significant. And I've seen people presenting this data which is completely wrong. What you need to understand, although these three subsets had little different way of outcome in heart failure, but despite their p-value of interaction being less than 0.05, these are not statistically significant. Because if you want to really see the p-value to be statistically significant in a subgroup analysis, this p-value of 0.05 has to be divided by the number of factors which you looked in the subgroup analysis. And here typically the p-value of which you can notice equal to 0.0015 should be only considered significant, which none of these three subgroup analysis looks to have. Therefore, this suggests that there was no difference irrespective of the region, irrespective of the blood pressure, or the respective of the insulin use. That you need to understand. Also, if you see the number of events happened in these subgroups are so small that you can't conclude with any subgroup, straight off heart failure. So thereby meaning that this heart failure data with Carmelina was statistically not different across the region or with insulin use or with the blood pressure cutoff. If you see the TECOS data on this your heart failure data, whether this is fast heart failure or cardiovascular death or all-cause death, this came damn neutral there by suggesting that there was neither any improvement on these outcomes nor any harm as far as patients with prior heart failure is concerned. So this data is not for the TECOS trial, but this data is for the patients with 18% heart failure at baseline. And this data suggests that even in a patients with heart failure, if you are using sitagliptin, there is no signals of increase in heart failure or heart failure-related cardiovascular death. Now let's focus into the renal endpoint on these trials. So this is Carmelina, because Carmelina needs to be discussed on renal outcome, because this was trial which was different from previous 3 CB outcome, as I talked on the renal outcome as a secondary endpoint. Although the composite of renal endpoint didn't came positive, as you can see the HR being 1.04, thereby meaning that there was no benefit in the renal composite, despite that we believed that linagliptin may have a potential to protect kidney. But there was at least a small consolation as one of the soft endpoint that there was a significant reduction in the progression to albuminuria by 14%, as you can appreciate the HR of 0.86. So this is one of the soft endpoint. One may debate whether the progression to albuminuria is important or regression from macro to micro is important. Of course, second is more important than the progression. But then at least some solace came through Carmelina that linagliptin has a potential to reduce progression to albuminuria. However, we were not surprised on this albuminuria data. If you look back into even Sebertimi, and Sebertimi perhaps has the best renal outcome data, the difference being that in Sebertimi, the renal data was a post hoc analysis. It wasn't pre-specified secondary endpoint as in Carmelina, but that doesn't make a huge difference as far as outcome is concerned. So if you see the Sebertimi albuminuria data, the Sebertimi sexagliptin had at least one good data, that there was a significant reduction to the progression or to the regression of albuminuria, which was twice as large as of linagliptin in Carmelina. So this was not the first time we saw in Carmelina, we saw it in Sebertimi. Unfortunately, the sexagliptin had a potential to reduce albuminuria, but it basically lends to increase in heart failure. So now this also perhaps need to be thought about, that as we thought that increase in albuminuria is related to increase in heart failure, But the sexagliptin has very paradoxical result. They had a decrease in albuminuria, but there was increase in heart failure. So sometimes, these links are not matched in the real, dedicated CB outcome trial. Similarly, if you see the TECOS trial, there was also signals of decrease in albuminuria, although this benefit was small, but this was statistically significant in the sitagliptin TECOS trial. So as I talked, it is not exclusive to the Carolina on albuminuria reduction. We saw it in Sebertimi even in larger extent than Carmelina, and we also noticed that a similar trend of reduction in albuminuria was also appreciated with sitagliptin compared to placebo, although it was small, but it was statistically significant as well in the TECOS trial. Now, if you see other renal endpoint in these CB outcome trial, you can see that whether it's Sebertimi or TECOS or Carmelina, these DPP4 inhibitors seems to do no damage to the kidney whatsoever compared to the placebo. Now, if you see the Carmelina data and try to understand what kind of CB saved these agents in a patients with CKD, because we saw TECOS and Seber to be damn neutral in a patients with kidney disease. Please remember, even in the Sebertimi trial, 75% patients had established kidney disease, almost very close to Carmelina. And there was no signal of anything on the composite of 3-point, but there was clearly the signals of increase in heart failure. But in Carmelina, again, this data came damn neutral, thereby suggesting that there is no signals on cardiovascular endpoint, even in a patient with established chronic kidney disease. Well then, how to analyze all this CB outcome trial together? I will quickly jump into understanding and meta-analyzing this 4 CB outcome trial together. So here is the meta-analysis of 4 CB outcome trials with DPP4 inhibitors. So this is 3-point MACE data on this 4 CB outcome trial, giving you a suggestion that there is no harm, no benefit, damn neutral HR with least heterogeneity, as you can see on their HR, coming to less than 1, 0.99, suggesting they are damn cardiovascular neutral drug. If you see the individual component of the 3-point MACE, so in cardiovascular death, it is neutral. If you meta-analyze 4 CB outcome trial, the HR being dot spot on 1, just below 1, thereby suggesting they are neutral, not decreasing nor increasing cardiovascular death. Similarly, on other endpoints, on non-fatal stroke, SCEM neutral, on non-fatal MI, suggesting again HR of 1, suggesting of CB neutrality. The heart failure data needs little attention because you know that currently in United States, all DPP4 inhibitor has heart failure leveling, unfortunately, including sitagliptin and linagliptin, despite knowing that TECOS didn't have any heart failure signals, and similarly wasn't in Carmelina. But this was 2 papers I'm going to tell you, which actually laid this level of heart failure even with sitagliptin. So this was the meta-analysis done which suggests that there is a signals of increase in heart failure, and it is primarily derived from the Sebertimi data, because at that point of time, Carmelina wasn't there. Similarly, the second paper in BMJ, you can see when they analyzed for all the heart failure trials with DPP4 inhibitor, there was a suggestion of increase in heart failure. So these 2 papers led FDA to ask put the level of heart failure on entire class of DPP4. But now this trend seems to be changing now. And see, if you see the heart failure hospitalization within these 4 CB outcome trial, if you add Carmelina into this list, this came damn neutral and is now completely deviating from the previous meta-analysis. Similarly, we challenged US FDA very recently when he added even the data from Omnion on omarigliptin, the 5th CB outcome trial, and you can see that there is no signals of heart failure with DPP4 inhibitor. And if you go again with all the heart failure outcome trials which looked for heart failure hospitalization with DPP4 inhibitor, which we came to this conclusion that there is no signals of heart failure hospitalization with DPP4 inhibitor. So ladies and gentlemen, to finish my presentation, what I talked about in this 20 minutes, these of DPP4 inhibitor are safe on the cardiovascular endpoint. The heart failure hospitalization which was seen in sexagliptin, sebertimi, and trend in alogliptin is not should be considered as a class effect because we didn't see it in TECOS, in Carmelina, and in Omnion with omarigliptin. There was a positive impact on albumin excretion in the Carmelina, but it was also seen in the previous 2 trials with sebertimi as well as in TECOS. Whether this should be stamped as a renal benefit, I exactly don't know, and I personally think it shouldn't be. If you see this TECOS and Carmelina, Sita and Lina seems to be equally similar and cardiovascular safe on all hard endpoint, thereby suggesting that both sitagliptin, linagliptin has now a robust cardiovascular safety data. When you look to other DPP4 inhibitor, in particular vildagliptin, tenali, and gemagliptin, they don't have any robust cardiovascular safety outcome trial, and so we don't know exactly their cardiovascular safety data. Thank you very much for your patience listening.